Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Wednesday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Along with Jim Geraghty of National Review, I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have good and bad and not too bad martinis today for conservatives, along with some interesting tidbits in all three of those as we recap the midterm elections. Some of the races yet to be called, so we don't know the exact numbers in Senate or House, or governor for that matter, although we're pretty sure on governor. But Jim, we're recording this late Wednesday morning. The president has yet to do his presser, and I just said before we started recording, let's hope he doesn't make any news since we're recording now. Good luck with that, huh?
What are the odds of that?
Yeah, I'm sure he won't say anything that causes people to raise their eyebrows a little bit. But let's start with the good martini, and no surprise, the good martini is that the Republicans not only keep the Senate, but they're going to expand the majority. The only question is by how much. The first state, among the first states to close the polls, was Indiana. Mike Braun jumped out to a big lead, and he really never let up that big lead. It's right around 10 points now with virtually all the votes counted. Joe Donnelly, the one-term Democrat who kind of lucked into the Senate seat 6 years ago because of abortion comments made by his opponent back then, he is gone. Mike Braun is in Indiana by a comfortable margin. In North Dakota, Kevin Cramer, also by roughly 10 points, defeats Heidi Heitkamp, the incumbent. In Missouri, a little bit closer, but not nearly as close as the polls were suggesting. Josh Hawley by about 6 over Claire McCaskill. Her luck finally runs out. And in Florida, it didn't look this way earlier in the night, but looks like Rick Scott has defeated three-term incumbent Democrat Bill Nelson, although apparently they've triggered an automatic recount there because the margin is 0.4%, and anything under 0.5 triggers the automatic recount. So CNN and MSNBC are dutifully reporting that race is not decided yet. We still don't know who's going to win in Arizona and Montana. And the number that's not really factored in there is that we're likely to pick up the Mississippi race that is headed to a runoff. The Republicans did lose in Nevada with Dean Heller. But overall, Jim, better than we thought would happen. And turns out voting against Brett Kavanaugh, not a very good idea.
No, I mean, look, I one of my most popular tweets of last night was a picture of smiling Brett Kavanaugh and the imagined but quite plausible quote of someone saying, "Justice Kavanaugh, we have some news out of Indiana." Just picturing that big smile on Brett Kavanaugh's face. Even West Virginia, like that's one of the great ironies. If there was any seat where Republicans were comfortable losing, Joe Manchin has voted for a good chunk of the president's nominees, including Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. And I'm sure there were a bunch of Democrats who would, if there was any senator who the Democrats would be comfortable losing, it was Manchin. Tough luck for Patrick Morrissey. Had a nice conversation with him early in the cycle. But, in the end, once Manchin took that, made that decision to be the 51st vote, it really made it tough to paint him as just another Washington Democrat, et cetera, et cetera. I think a good reason of why Republicans feel so good this morning, and as we go through our martinis, maybe they shouldn't. This was not an unalloyed victory, and in fact, it was a very mixed bag. But look, there was a great deal of hype about Florida. We all know what an important state it is in the general election. We think back to the 2000 recount, et cetera. And the expectation was that despite Bill Nelson being really just on the side of a milk carton for most of his Senate career and being this utterly unobtrusive, generic, kind of doddering old man, he's out. So I guess I can say really nasty things about him now, Greg. Bill Nelson was just kind of there for 3 terms, and Rick Scott was the guy who had been, governor, elected by 1%. Everybody thought he was going to go down in 2014, gets reelected by 1%, and it looks like he's done it for a 3rd time in a row. Never try to kill Rick Scott because you will fail by 1%. So that was kind of, and the other one was, Democrats were understandably really excited about Andrew Gillum. Their nominee for governor, African-American, mayor of Tallahassee. And the idea was, look, this guy is a true blue progressive who wanted to put through giant tax hikes, expand Medicaid, that this was going to be a demonstration that, somebody who was, if not exactly a Bernie Sandersite, if not exactly an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez type, then down the street from that mentality, not terribly far from that, could win in a really big state and a big key state, in a state that Republicans thought they had done, they'd a state that Republicans, were really worried about. And we kind of braced ourselves for that early announcement in those races, and it didn't happen. The night just kept going on, and the races get closer, and the people who follow it county by county kept saying, this doesn't look too bad for Rick Scott and DeSantis. This is actually, they're hanging in there. They could end up finishing this. The panhandle came in. There was really, I didn't hear any reports about the turnout being lower in those counties that were hit hard by the hurricane. That was a big step for Republicans and the perception of tonight that they came through there. The governor's race, which we'll talk a little bit more there. At this point, Brian Kemp looks like the winner. He's got 50.5%. In Georgia, you need 50% to avoid a runoff. Stacey Abrams, who, again, perhaps next to Beto O'Rourke, the second most hyped Democratic candidate of the entire cycle by the media. Abrams at this hour is down by 2%. This is a fairly considerable margin. And she thinks that if with all the absentees come in, they might, that Kemp might not be at 50%. And they might have to go to a runoff. Republicans have a really good record in the runoffs in Georgia. So that's not, something she should necessarily say is, she's out of the woods if that happens. The mood among Georgia Republicans is they've got the margin. Abrams would need to win the absentee ballots by a huge margin in order to push him below 50%. Theoretically possible, but not something that really is the sort of thing. She basically have to win him in the neighborhood of like 60-40. And if the whole state was 50-50, it's really tough to come up and win with 60-40 split on those outstanding ballots there. You went through all the Senate races there, Greg. Look, credit must be given to Donald Trump that he went to almost all these states and did big rallies. And, wisely they did them in the corners of these states that are more receptive to the Trump message. Places like Ohio, the Senate race was not close, and really it wasn't expected to be. But I think one of the interesting things there is, everybody kind of knew, okay, Sherrod Brown, he's got a real good blue collar, thing. He as of this hour, it's 100% of the precincts reporting. These numbers shouldn't change very much. Brown has 53.2%. Bernacchi had 46.8%. That's not the big double-digit margin that some people were predicting, and some people thought it was to be in the teens. That's not terrible. By contrast, right next door in Pennsylvania, Lou Barletta could not get close to Bob Casey. You want to talk about where Republicans can feel kind of optimistic about this? John James, the guy who you and I had said deserved a heck of a lot more attention and credit, he was within 5 points of Debbie Stabenow. At this hour, 46.3% to 51.7%. John James should just announce tomorrow, Greg, that he's running for Senate in 2020. There's another Senate seat open. Just, you keep plugging away at this, Republicans could win a Senate seat there. There are 2 seats out there that were, as of now, John Tester is narrowly ahead. There's a couple more precincts that need to report. Credit where it's due. Rosendale did have that a lot closer than the polls indicated. And I'm going to take a victory lap on Arizona, Greg. I was saying the early vote pointed to McSally winning. As of this hour, it is a 16,000 vote margin with 11 precincts needing to report. In my mind, you can call that one. You're not going to get 16,000 votes out of 11 precincts, but I guess we'll see what happens there, Greg. But otherwise, look, Senate-wise, Republicans have a lot to celebrate, and if for all the talk of the blue wave and all that kind of stuff, there was a blue wave in the House races, but a red wave in the Senate. And I think this puts Republicans in a really good spot for all future judicial confirmation fights. Really good spot to keep the Senate after 2020, which was, I think, something that, Mitch McConnell and other Republicans were worried about. And finally, Greg, look, if somebody had said, do you want to trade the House for the chance to replace Clarence Thomas if he chooses to retire in the next 2 years? And maybe Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and maybe Stephen Breyer over the next 2 years, I think a lot of Republicans would take that trade.
I think it was your colleague and your sometimes substitute host, Alexander DeSanctis, who said she was disappointed there weren't any Amy Coney Barrett gifts out there this morning because if there is a vacancy, that became a lot more likely. And let's just talk about a couple of races that didn't flip, but got a lot of attention, kind of like Indiana, which was thought to be very tight. Tennessee was thought to be very tight for a long time. The Taylor Swift endorsement not working at all for Phil Bredesen. Marsha Blackburn wins that by double figures. And you mentioned Beto O'Rourke in passing there. He made it closer than just about anybody else probably would have in Texas. Only a couple points that he lost to by Ted Cruz. But after $70 million and glowing profiles in virtually every liberal-leaning publication in the world, he did not get it done. And true to form, Slate today, or last night actually, with the story, "Don't overthink it. Just nominate Beto in 2020. So the love affair continues even in defeat. In fact, it was Reuters, even before the polls closed in Texas, that said, win or lose, Beto has been victorious. So their definition of victorious is a little different.
Pretty much summarized the media's perspective on this race the entire time. I guess we should give Beto O'Rourke some credit. That was the best performance of a Texas Democrat since, I believe, Ann Richards. And I didn't think he would be that close. So, 3 points, it's nothing to sneeze at. Now, because Texas is such a big state with so many people voting, it's like, 240,000 votes? Coming within 3% is still a lot of votes you had to make up out there. I still think the height to performance ratio was out of whack on this one. The other thing I think is kind of interesting, everyone's talking about, Beto fell short. Give credit to Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz knew that this was not going to be a walk in the park. He talked about this with reporters plenty of times during this race. He's pointed out that Trump's margin again over Hillary in 2016 in Texas was 8 points. That was the same as his margin in Ohio. That this was a state that had a decent number of Democrats, and if the Democrats were really, really energized, Republicans could lose if they took it for granted. And Ted Cruz did not take it for granted. And I think as much as the Democrats are trying to console themselves, it's like, well, it came really close, and Beto energized people, and they did pick up a couple of those House seats, which we'll talk about in a future martini. Let's point out that they thought that if there were more than 8 million votes cast, Beto would win, and it would be great for Democrats. And I believe it was the last I checked, 8.3 million votes cast. That's a huge total, and Ted Cruz won. So kudos to Texas Republicans. Kudos to the Cruz campaign and all their get-out-the-vote operations. 4.2 million votes in a Senate race is a huge total, and it shows that the Cruz team ate their Wheaties.
Yeah, and he was great at getting out the vote, even in the presidential primaries. It wasn't enough, but he squeezed out every vote he could find. And Jim, this other thing, I think Vox started it about the popular vote for, if the Republicans gain the majority, but they lose the popular vote for all the Senate races, as if that's something, that there's going to be this huge blowback. And even Ken Delanian over at NBC, the question is how much longer the American majority will tolerate being pushed around by a rural minority. And so my favorite answer on Twitter was, as long as we have the Constitution.
First question to him is, so how many Republican votes do Republicans get in the Senate race in California?
Almost none.
No, none. Exactly. There were no Republicans on the ballot.
Yes.
Because of the way California does it, first two past the post in the primary, it was a Democrat versus Democrat race. The same thing happened in 2016. Okay? So every time you're like, my goodness, look at how many more. Well, it's because you got, actually, I have the numbers here. You got something in the neighborhood of 6.1 million Democratic votes and 0 Republican votes. Do you think that's going to throw the numbers much? Secondly, if you want to say the nationwide, well, look, there were a lot more blue states up for re-election, up for election this year. There were no Senate races in the Carolinas, no Senate race in Georgia, no Senate race in Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Kansas. I'm looking at this map, like South Dakota, Idaho. You think there would have been a bunch of Republican votes if they'd had Senate races there? I think so.
It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing.
It's a dumb, constitutionally illiterate argument, and people who say this and take it seriously deserve to have rotten fruit tossed at them, Greg.
That's exactly right. They don't understand the concept of states and how this debate played out at all during the constitutional era. But anyway, good night overall for the Republicans on the Senate. Let's get to the bad martini now, and that is the situation in the House. We talked yesterday about how the Democrats were likely to win the majority. They have. Several seats are yet to be called. MSNBC is just kind of pushing out there from based on what we know right now. They think it's going to be a 230 to 205 Democratic majority. CNN's right now got it 222 to 199 and Fox 220 to 193. Some states, Republicans lost pretty handily. They lost a number of seats. They lost 3 in Virginia, 3 in Pennsylvania, net, 2 in Illinois, 3 in New York, 3 in New Jersey, 2 in Florida. Looks like they're going to lose 3 probably in California, 2 in Texas, 2 in Iowa, and then a handful, a seat each in some other states. So, Jim, there's always, with 435 seats, some that you're like, yeah, I had a bad feeling about that one, and some others you're like, wait, what? And so the numbers are always just a little bit off from what you project, but you had 25 seats, and it looks like it's going to be pretty close.
Yeah, maybe, probably anywhere from 6 to 12 more than my estimate. A bunch of these were predictable. Barbara Comstock, this was the kind of district that Trump was just going to be kryptonite in. Dave Bratt going down does not make, hey, everybody who was so happy for Dave Bratt when he beat Eric Cantor a couple cycles ago, where were you? Did you miss a memo or something? Scott Taylor in Virginia. These were all seats Republicans could have and should have won in better circumstances. I don't know if that's entirely Corey Stewart's fault, but I think it's safe to say that not having a competitive Senate race did not help these things. Probably the shocker of the night, and one that I didn't even see it till this morning, and I checked. It felt like it couldn't possibly be right. South Carolina's 1st district, one that you and I are familiar with. It's down in Hilton Head and Beaufort County, and it goes up to Charleston, some of the suburbs around there. Democrat Joe Cunningham beat Katie Arrington in South Carolina's 1st district. This is Mark Sanford's old district. Arrington beat Sanford in the primary. This is deep Republican territory usually. This is one where now Joe Cunningham, I called up Dad and said, "What happened? Did you take a nap? What?" And the answer is that Joe Cunningham ran as I'm going to be a conservative Democrat. Now we get to see. Maybe Joe Cunningham turns into the Republicans' favorite Democrat. My guess is that he won't because, a lot of these candidates lie. And this may be a one-term rental, that at some point Republicans put a little more resources into this district. They don't take it for granted, and it happens. You saw Oklahoma City's district, Democrat with. This is the case where the race where the Republican won by 21 points last cycle. They're going to hear some Republicans saying, it wasn't that bad in the House. No, this was pretty darn bad. This was, you lost a bunch of the ones you expected to. You lost some you didn't expect to. Yeah, there are a bunch of seats that held on there. Your Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, your Mario Diaz-Balarts in Florida, up here in Virginia, Denver Riggleman winning was pretty good. But Republicans gave away a lot of seats that they did not want to give away in this cycle. And maybe the electoral circumstances will be different. One of those weird times where the higher turnout might help Republicans having Trump on the ballot in some of these places. But in some of these places, like Isa's district out in California, or I think the Comstock district, I think these are gone for Republicans for a long while, certainly for the remainder of the Trump era, just because of the demographics and Trump's style and how this plays amongst those soccer moms. So it was not a great night for Republicans in the House. And as much as I can understand the excitement over the Senate races and some of the governor's races, they shouldn't underplay this. They should recognize that they have some rebuilding to do. The only good news is they get to do it up against, probably Nancy Pelosi.
Yes, exactly. Nancy Pelosi thanking her supporters last night, thanking all the activists, and then thanking an odd, I don't know, it's not a person, it's a thing. Here's what Nancy Pelosi thanked for the Democratic majority.
McConnell's assault on Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act, and the health care of 130 million Americans living with pre-existing medical conditions. Let's hear it more for pre-existing medical conditions.
Are we rooting for them? Right? I'd love to hear one of these times somebody to make. Of course, as much as I don't like Nancy Pelosi, I don't think she's pro people suffering from pre-existing medical conditions. But it'd be kind of fun if, let's hear it for that, and you just heard crickets. The audience are so shame on Nancy Pelosi. She makes the verbal error. But you know what? That's not really a great reflection on the audience there either. Just kind of conditioned. Yay! Whatever she's saying, yay! Yeah,
they're cheering for her no matter what. Other bad news on the House. Looks like Mia Love in Utah is done. Republicans are probably going to lose the 8th district in Washington. They're going to lose the 8th district in Michigan, and they've lost the 3rd district in Kansas. But it was a great night for? accused felons because Chris Collins in New York, Duncan Hunter in California, and Senator Bob Menendez all reelected last night.
I was going to say, Greg, there were a couple of Republicans I wouldn't have minded losing, and we managed to keep some of those guys. So there we are.
All right, let's move on to the governors. And we've talked about this a little bit. Republicans, we were expecting a bloodbath yesterday. Did not turn out to be that bad, although there were some major losses. Michigan definitely went to the Democrats by a wide margin. Kansas, again, Chris Kobach, a little bit more of a polarizing nominee there. He lost pretty handily. We knew Bruce Rauner was going down in Illinois. That's no shock. The thing that kept me up much later than I should have been last night was hoping that Scott Walker could pull it out in Wisconsin, but they suddenly found a few tens of thousands of votes in Milwaukee County right at the worst possible time, and that's not going to work out for him. In the end, we did pick up, though, in Ohio. We didn't pick up. Well, I guess from John Kasich, you could consider that a pickup. Mike DeWine wins. We did not expect that. We talked about Ron DeSantis defeating Gillum there, and that's a big deal because they've got 3 pending state Supreme Court nominations, and those of us who remember the 2000 fight would definitely want a Republican appointing state Supreme Court justices down there. It also looked bleak for a while last night for Kim Reynolds in Iowa, but she ultimately pulled it off, and as you mentioned, we think Brian Kemp won for the Republicans in Georgia, but Stacey Abrams not conceding and thinking she can possibly push that to a runoff. So a bad night, I would say, on the Democratic side, but not nearly as bad as we thought it could be.
Yeah, I was going to say that, I think it was John Ekdahl who said that great news for Republicans in Ohio, they flipped the governor's mansion this year. But, I wonder if John Kasich has any plans for 2020. The governors, look, Republicans were bracing themselves for losing the governor's mansions in Florida, in Georgia, and in Ohio, and in Iowa. And if you don't lose those, you had a pretty good night. That actually is better than it was. Lost a bunch elsewhere. Some you kind of expected, like Maine. I think it's safe to say that the Paul LePage era up there is not what they wanted. Scott Walker hurts, but I suppose it's one of those things where if you escape death so many times, so to speak, sooner or later your luck is going to run out. This is still a kind of purple state. The Senate race was not close, and things just did not shake out the way they wanted. We kind of expected to lose Nevada. It's a very purple to bluish state. Republicans can win in certain circumstances, but not a lot of things you can say, oh, this is a definite guarantee. But I went through this at the end of the Jolt today, and I pointed out there's a decent number of Republican governors who you don't hear about a lot. And I very, every once in a while when Morning Consult does its, I think every 3 months or so, they poll the approval rating of every governor in the country. And I believe for like the last, year and a half, 2 years, some of the 10 most popular governors in the country have all been Republicans. And so you look at it like, yeah. And then you look at the list and you're like, these guys are Republicans. I didn't, I've never heard of these guys. And, it's not your fault, but, some of these guys don't get a ton of attention. Maybe you could say Charlie Baker in Massachusetts is well known, or Larry Hogan in Maryland, both very deep blue states. I think in both cases, Larry Hogan definitely, he's not bringing about this sweeping conservative renaissance to the Bay State. I described him earlier in the year as a hockey goalie. He keeps the bad stuff from getting through. That's his job, is to hold down the excesses of a Democratic state legislature. So the conservative, Doug Ducey in Arizona, definitely conservative. Greg Abbott in Texas, definitely conservative. I think you could argue Chris Sununu in New Hampshire. Phil Scott in Vermont is another one of those guys who's he's the brakes to a Democratic state legislature. McMaster in South Carolina. I know there are a bunch of conservatives in South Carolina who think he's kind of a little porky, not terribly tough on controlling spending as much as they'd like to see. But there are a bunch of Republican governors who are doing pretty darn well, and they're not getting a ton of flash and attention because they don't want to. Their job, they are competent administrators, and I feel like in this era, Greg, this is greatly underrated. They're not like Chris Christie, and you're going to see him on Jimmy Fallon or something like that. No, there's not a lot of hype around them, not a lot of excitement. I know everybody. Look, we talked about the state of the country, and we talked about the state of the Republican Party in the lead up to this election, Greg. I know I'm in a minority on this, Greg, but I love the governors who want to make America boring again. There's something to be said for boring, competent administration. I don't need to be the vanguard of a revolution and running to the barricades and all that kind of stuff. But, so a bunch of Republican governors won there. lost a bunch they feel like they could have won or should have won, but all in all, not as bad as they thought it could be. I think probably the two interesting upshots looking forward are – actually, I'll give you a really optimistic take, Greg, and people can laugh at this like 6 months to a year from now. If the Democrats had not taken the House and Republicans had had the sweeping win, I really think the hard lefties would have gotten violent. I think that the attitude among the hard left would be the elections are always rigged. It's Trump and voter suppression and Diebold and Russian hackers and all that kind of stuff. We must take to the streets, and the Antifa protesters you see in Portland, I think, would spread to a lot of places. The Democrats get their win. They get to control the House. They get to issue subpoenas for Trump's tax returns. Trump's going to ignore them. Trump's going to have somebody to campaign against for the next 2 years. Nothing gets done in the House, but nothing was going to get done in the House that much. And even if Republicans had held it by 2 seats, Republicans get to focus the next 2 years on judicial appointments. That's not the worst turnout of all this kind of how these things shake out. And the other thing is that if you're the Democrats and you just won a House majority, but not a terribly big House majority. And as I mentioned, some of these are built on districts that you didn't win these. You're renting them, in South Carolina and Oklahoma City and places like that. You got to get some stuff done. And I don't know if let's look at the president's tax returns. Let's investigate the heck out of them. I don't know if that's really the sort of thing that builds a lasting majority and excitement and all that kind of stuff. And the other thing is that by and large, we knew Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was going to win in her district. It's like 90-some% Democrat. The progressives did not have the great night that they were expecting, particularly with Florida and Georgia and Ohio and stuff like that. So really, the great progressive revolution will not be televised, Greg, because it's not happening.
It's totally happening in 2 years, though. That's what you're going to hear, because they're going to run Beto.
I mean,
they answered everything.
If you're Beto, you might as well. Not only he's got to spend time being senator, right?
Well, Jim, could have been better, but it could have been a whole lot worse. And we'll enjoy this expanded Senate majority and hope we can add Arizona here for sure in the next little bit of time. And we'll talk again. Actually, we won't talk again tomorrow. You're off until Tuesday, so enjoy your time off.
I am. So hope everyone had a fun election season. I will be back on Tuesday with probably new insights. And who knows, by then we may even have some of these races resolved.
We can only hope. Probably not in California, though. They take forever. Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. And be sure to tune in again tomorrow, because there will be another edition of the 3 Martini Lunch.